Look, there's a lot to discuss when you're talking about €88 billion in expenditure in a year. But I want to first of all raise things that I consider very urgent for people who have endured a particularly difficult time or are likely to endure a particularly difficult time as we face into Christmas. And obviously a considerable amount of the additional money that was spent in relation to COVID income supports revolves around PUP and EWIS and all of that. And I was trying to get this across to the Taoiseach, and I'm going to try and get it across to you for the sake of the thousands and thousands of mostly self-employed people who are musicians, entertainers, performers, taxi drivers, and then also people who may be employees or would have been employees in the hospitality and nighttime sector. And just to really try and get the message across to you, Minister, and hope that you will pass this on over the next few days, because whether the government acts is going to determine whether people who've had a very, very hard time over the last 2 years are going to have a miserable Christmas or no Christmas, or are going to get a bit of support from the government, okay? As we speak, people who were applying for the PUP in those categories, musicians, entertainers, performers, are receiving letters saying you're not getting the PUP. You're not eligible, you're not getting it. Or we're bringing you in for an interview to determine whether you're entitled to it. And I'm inundated over the last number of days with people explaining this to me. Now, surely it is self-evident to the Department of Social Protection, surely it is absolutely blindingly obvious that if you are a musician or if you are an entertainer and performer, given the public health measures, there's nothing to prove. There is no work for you for the next 4 or 5 weeks at a time when you would have expected to make most of your money. Why on earth are we making these people jump through hoops? Why are they being told, for example, why are they being asked stupid questions like, have you got 4 PRSI weekly contributions in the week before the measures came in? When they, even if they were working, they wouldn't have them because they pay their PRSI at the end of the year. Right? This is stupid stuff, and people are being refused and they're being made jump through hoops, considerable anxiety and worry for these people in the run into Christmas. And I repeat, these are the people who've been hit repeatedly. Right? Everybody's been affected by this pandemic, everybody. But who are the people who are worst hit? They are those people. Anybody who are dependent on, the nighttime economy, tourism, people going out and about generally, and socialising, it is self-evident that they are the people who are being hit now again and have been hit repeatedly. They've been hit the worst and they've been hit the longest. And frankly, the Department of Social Protection is just making work for itself, which I could say the people in the department could probably do without, in terms of making people jump through hoops a week before Christmas. So I'm really appealing to the Minister to pass this upstairs. The MEAI, who represent the musicians and entertainers, and who also work with a cross-party committee that every party is represented in, wrote to Catherine Martin on November the 22nd appealing for a meeting to discuss all these issues. All those issues now have even got more problematic as we run into Christmas, and still no meeting. To just get it into the heads of the government that while some of the supports that you're giving out are sort of, simple enough, because you're giving them to standing employers in the funded sector, for example, of arts, or to a venue that has set employees, the vast, vast majority of people who are musicians, entertainers and performers in this country are self-employed individuals. And those people, their work is gone, right? And they don't have a standing relationship to a particular employer. So we should do what was done at the outset of PUP, and the default position is that anybody, particularly in those categories, who go in and apply for PUP should be given it, unless there's a very, very good reason for imagining they're not entitled to it. But how could they not be entitled to it? Seriously, like. It's ridiculous. Another anomaly is some people were on the scheme where you got 900, you could earn up to 960 and still hold your PUP. Those people are now not able to get the full level of PUP that someone who wasn't on that scheme. So if you weren't on that scheme after December the 7th, you could apply and get to 350, but if you were on the scheme where you were trying to do a bit of work, and there was a bit of work, remember before all the public health measures hit, so you could possibly earn a bit on top of it, but that work has now collapsed for them. So it's not fair to discriminate against that cohort, because things have changed. So they should be entitled to, in the case of musicians, entertainers and performers, they should be entitled to the full level of the PUP. Then there is another group of people who are continuing to try and work. So there's some taxi drivers, because they're getting sick, they're old, they're vulnerable, for example, or don't want to go out there and work. I was talking to a woman today whose husband got COVID, right, and you know, he's not going to go out to work. In the current climate because of Omicron and so on. There's others who are out there getting a bit of work, but there's very little work out there for them. So for those people, they should have the 960 and be able to earn up to that, right, and get the PUP. But we need a bit of common sense being used by the department in terms of not holding back on giving people support. Whether they're people whose work has completely collapsed because of public health measures and what the public are doing to respond positively to the government's public health measures and the impact that is having them, or whether they're significantly reduced in their work. And just to explain to people, in case it needs to be explained, you might walk out in the street there at the moment and think, oh, I can see people milling around town, I can see a few taxis picking people up. But you've advised office workers not to go to work, right? So tens and tens of thousands of office workers who would normally be in town who'd use taxis are not using them. There's much less people going through Dublin Airport. At night time, the nighttime economy has disappeared, or very significantly reduced. Right? So don't be under the illusion that somehow there's loads of work out there for taxi drivers. There isn't. There's some bits of work, but it is very, very substantially reduced, and for some it's not worth it, or because they're older, vulnerable, they're not willing to risk it. Right? And give them support. And stop getting the Department of Social Protection to hold out on them. It is completely, completely unfair in the teeth of Christmas. Some other urgent groups that need to be considered. Okay, the household benefits package has not seen increases for I don't know how long. Okay, and many of the people who are on the household benefits package, elderly people over 70 who need heat during the winter facing into the next period, are not entitled to the fuel allowance. But they've seen no increase in the household benefits package for several years. They need an increase to help them with their bills through the coming period. So would the government please address that as a matter of urgency? The student nurses, right? It is bad enough that it was more than a year ago since People Before Profit brought a motion in here asking for the student nurses and midwives to be paid while they were on placement, when they're working on the front lines. Right? And the government refused, and still refuses, to pay them for their work on placement. I mean, that is really deplorable in my opinion. It is so short-sighted when you think about, they say, why can't we increase the capacity of ICU up to the levels that were recommended, 10 years ago? Oh, because we can't get the staff. It takes a while to train the staff. Why is it difficult to train the staff? Because about 70 to 80% of student nurses leave this country after they qualify because they're treated so badly as student nurses and midwives. Okay, but we won't pay them on the placement to maybe encourage them to stay. But not only that, as if that isn't bad enough, the €100 miserable that was promised to the student nurses and midwives wasn't paid. The miserable, concession that was given by the government, not paid. to the student nurses and midwives, or to many of them. The neurological nurse specialists. We have a major shortage of these specialist nurses. The Neurological Association of Ireland is campaigning for 100 posts, and have been for some time, for these nurses. The availability of these nurses would very significantly impact on the outpatient waiting lists, which, as we know, are dire. St Vincent's, for example, should have 22 of these nurses. They have 4. And when they need 22. This is something that the government should be allocating money to. And of course, let's remember that in a whole number of areas of the health service, that where we don't put in the investment and the decent conditions and pay and so on for the desperately needed staff we need to build up the capacity in the health service, we end up paying more for it, because we then have to go out to the private sector and outsource it to them, who then make money out of it. So we pay for this. We need to invest now in the public system in areas where we need new posts, and this is one particular area I just want to shout out for, but in fact this is true in a whole number of areas across the health service. I mentioned psychologists, who I brought up multiple occasions, and here the huge amount of difficulties that people have qualifying for doctorates in psychology, when we have massive waiting lists, where we need psychologists to address the waiting lists and so on, and we are charging them massive fees, and it is extraordinarily difficult for people to qualify, particularly if they're from working class backgrounds, less well-off backgrounds. They can't afford the fees, they can't afford to sustain themselves during their post-grad degrees and so on, and as a result we have a shortage of these psychologists, which we need at all sorts of levels, in health, in education and so on, to address the waiting lists, and yet we don't put the investment in. I also just want to make a point about local government. People again should know certain things, right? The average amount of money, of national income, that is spent in Europe by local authorities is 28%. In Ireland, it is 8%. Right? So the amount of money given to local authorities to provide local services is a fraction of what it is in the rest of Europe. And let's remind ourselves of the big lie about the local property tax, a regressive form of funding of local government that at the time we were told was going to significantly increase the available resources for local government to improve local services. Did any of it happen? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not a cent. In fact, things are getting worse at local government level. So, for example, in my area, a fantastic festival that was organised by the local authority every year, the Mountains to the Sea, Literature Festival, cancelled next year because of lack of money. No new money for books for the libraries. Less money for housing maintenance, despite huge problems in terms of housing maintenance in the social housing stock. No new trees planted and a reduction in the pruning service. These are just a few examples in our area. Reduction in the amount of money available for street cleaning and local repairs to roads. So people end up paying a more aggressive form of taxation than central government funding, which is based on a more progressive income-related tax. Does it produce extra money for the local authorities and extra services? Not at all. Not at all. Things are actually getting worse. Another urgent one. In my area, there's a thing called the Accessible Community Transport Southside. And it provides door-to-door transport services for people with, who are in wheelchairs or who have very severe, significant mobility issues. Fantastic service, essentially run by a voluntary group of people with disability or advocates for people with disability. This, by the way, is modelled, this thing, on what the Canadian government do as a government, where they actually have door-to-door transport for people. Because if you're in a wheelchair, or if you have very significant mobility problems, if you're older, or have dementia, or whatever, the public transport system won't work for you. Right? This service provides for about 6,000 people with those mobility issues in my area. They are facing a massive funding crisis because the way they essentially generate their revenue, as well as some government money, but they generate some of their own revenue by charging a small fare to the people, which they shouldn't have to do, by the way, people with disability and wheelchairs. I mean, you get free transport and public transport, you should be getting a free on something like this. They don't get that, but they're not even complaining about that. They're just saying, we now don't have that revenue stream, and as a result, our service is going to close down for the lack of, in the immediate term, €50,000, but also they need to replace their fleet of buses, and they don't have the money to do that either. And these are, relatively small amounts of money. I've been asking about this, but this would be a disaster. This is a group of volunteers providing a service that, frankly, the state should provide, and for the lack of really buttons in order to maintain this service, this group of people who are very vulnerable people with disabilities and their supporters and advocates, essentially doing the state's job for them, but that service could be gone unless the state intervenes and gives them relatively small amounts of money. So again, I would appeal to the Minister on that issue. One last point I want to make is about inflation generally and pay. And there's a debate that goes on in academic economic circles, but it's a sort of ideological right-left debate, which is the reason we got inflation is because workers were always asking for pay rises, and that's why you get inflation. Now, have we not had absolutely, beyond question, confirmation that that was a load of nonsense over the last few years in this country? Because workers have been held back with very, very small pay increases, pay cuts after the economic collapse of 2008, which wasn't their fault, but very, very small pay increases, 1% or whatever, and yet inflation is galloping past that. Now up over 5%, and that doesn't even adequately really take into account the impact of rising accommodation costs, which are, as we all know, absolutely off the Richter scale and contributing to a major crisis for working people who simply cannot afford the rents or the house prices of housing, which have gone through the roof, and now these energy price hikes. None of that is as a result of workers asking for increased pay. But are they not now justified in actually demanding that pay? And I would say, Minister, they are. Because in effect, workers are suffering pay cuts now. If inflation is running at over 5%, but you're held back to a 1% pay increase, the cost of living going through the roof, you are in effect seeing your pay cut. And let us remember that that is all happening while corporate profits have gone through the roof in this country over that same period. And where we know certain people in Irish society have done very, very well, when you look at the central bank's household wealth figures, absolutely through the roof as well. It's clearly not trickling down to the vast majority of workers. Somebody's getting very rich in this country, and has done over the last 10 years. Profits up, and the household wealth of the richest in our country have gone up. And yet the government won't try and find the funds we need for some of the sort of things that I've mentioned here by imposing a little bit extra tax on those people in order to fund the expenditure to at least ensure that workers' pay keeps pace with inflation, to ensure that we can attract the staff and qualified staff we need in areas like health and education and a whole number of sectors where there's a big shortage, right? And a big shortage of skilled people that we need is not because people are on the PUP. You know, I've heard this narrative coming out of the government over the last while. Oh, the reason we can't get people is because they're on the PUP. They're all living it up on the PUP. That's nonsense. Absolute nonsense, right? Give the PUP to the people who are unemployed as a result of public health measures, but if you want to address the shortages of labour in a whole number of areas, whether it's health, education, construction and so on, pay people properly. Bring down the cost of living bring down the cost of accommodation by investing in those things, instead of lining the pockets of people who are essentially profiting out of the shortages in housing and healthcare capacity and so on. I'll leave it at that.